Welcome, everyone. This is Anthony Radich at WESTAF. We're going to wait about a minute and begin formally. We have a number of people still logging on rapidly, so 1 minute from now we'll begin. Thank you. Well, let's get started. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Anthony Radich, the Executive Director of WESTAF, the Western States Arts Federation. With me today is Brian Points, the Director of Consulting at WESTAF Data Partner, Economic Modeling Specialist International, or EMSI. This is the second of a three-part webinar series concerned with data related to arts and the broader creative economy. This webinar will sort through and compare and contrast the arts and creative economy data streams that are currently available. A third webinar in this series will be presented on June 21st. It will feature ways to best put your creative economy data to work. That session will especially focus on how to best present data to make your case. This webinar will be approximately 30 minutes in length. Following the presentation, we will have time for a few questions. Please note that the way for you to ask questions is to type your questions into the box provided on the webinar screen. We prepared this webinar series because after talking with a number of practitioners in the arts field, we became aware of the fact that although many arts leaders are interested in finding ways to put data to work in support of their efforts, they are sometimes overwhelmed and even confused by the multiple flows of data available in the field today. In addition, they often do not know what to do with the data they already have access to. One reason data is increasingly available in the field is that technology has made the collection, cleaning, organization, and computation of data more feasible than ever. Advances in technology have flooded the world at large with data, and now it is the arts and culture sector's turn to enjoy this wealth of data or be terrified by it. Before we start, I want to note that if you are challenged by the amount of data available in the art and creative economy field today, or have difficulty articulating the differences between data sets and data project offerings, that you are not alone. Remember, our field contains a number of effective administrators who are very versed in data and uses of data, but many others who come from practitioner areas such as dance, etc., who's never had a data class in their life. So it's understandable how some of you may not be familiar with data and the language surrounding data. Before we begin our formal presentation, I'd like to ask if Brian Points has a few words to say about data and some of the clients he intersects with and how they are approaching data today.
Thanks, Anthony. So in the previous webinar, we talked about why data, and during that we explained that using data is going to get you into different kinds of conversations, and the conversations that you're having are going to get you attention in a way that you didn't before, because it's speaking a different kind of language that's not simply qualitative, but it's quantitative as well. The big data revolution is affecting everybody, and it's now the turn of the arts industry to experience that. And some of the things that I've seen in other industries that have adapted to this, including human resources and education, some common pitfalls, some things to keep in mind. This is kind of, in a nutshell, statistics 101, what you would learn if you were to take a class like that you should be suspicious about when it comes to data. So we don't expect everybody to be a data expert, but we do want everybody to at least be confident in their ability to ask the right kinds of questions, and that's part of what we're trying to accomplish here. So one thing to keep in mind is the freshness of the data that you're looking at. So a lot of free data sources that some of you use or some of you are becoming familiar with are helpful, but they may have certain weaknesses, like not being as recent as some of the paid subscriptions or data services that you could get from elsewhere. So you don't want to be using data that's 10 years old or even 3 years old if you can possibly use data that's from a more recent period than that. So recency of the data is one thing. Comprehensiveness of the data. Is it some nationwide data set that's just been, maybe the practitioner has taken some ratio from the nation and they've applied it to your region? Well, that may not actually make sense. It may be actually very inaccurate. There's not enough of they're too dissimilar, the nation and your region, to make those kinds of assumptions. So you want something that's more grounded in your local reality. Do you want to break it down by county, by zip code, something along those lines? And then lastly, the way in which it's cleaned or modeled or treated should be a process that you should be able to at least see the methodology of it and see that it's not just taking some national ratios and is applying it locally, that it's something that's being done with has a bit more information to base that model upon. So those are some things to keep in mind when looking at big data. And then lastly, of course, don't get caught up in paralysis by analysis. There's big data in and of itself is not very helpful. What you need is somebody who can break that down and boil it into something useful.
Thanks, Brian, for that useful advice, and thanks again for joining us today. I know you're a busy person, but we appreciate your time. Let's move on here and talk a bit about creative economy data providers. In today's webinar, we cannot cover every data source available for use in arts and creative economy work. I will, however, cover 5 data providers that are most commonly used today. Before I start, I want to caution the participants in this webinar that each of these sources of data has complexities and nuances that cannot be fully covered in the webinar. Please understand that some simplification is needed in order to develop this presentation in a way that is coherent and useful. One way to look at the data provided in the market today is to think of how inclusive the various providers are. In this visualization, you can see that some providers like Data Arts and APTA's Art and Economic Prosperity are highly specific in what they provide, while the CVSuite and NEA, BEA efforts are more broad and inclusive. Please note that there is no right or wrong approach to this, and what you cannot see here is that highly specific data providers, especially Data Arts, can offer quite deep levels of data. So again, going back and looking at this visualization, on the far left, you have Data Arts that covers in-depth the nonprofit cultural industries. Arts and Economic Prosperity covers the nonprofits and audience intercept. And then you have the CVSuite, NEA, BEA that are much, much broader and cover some of these areas in a little less depth. So this is one way to think of data and how it's provided to you. Another way to think about the data that is available out there is to consider how much of what is offered concentrates on the nonprofit sector and how much on the for-profit sector. In this visualization, you can see 4 data providers and the level of concentration on nonprofit. Again, Data Arts exclusively on the nonprofit at this time, Art and Economic Prosperity largely, CVSuite a mix of the two, NEA, BEA a mix of the two. So again, another way of visualizing the range of things that are available and the level of concentration of nonprofit, for-profit sector focus. Today there are a number of sources of creative economy data. In the field, I'm going to name 5 sources that are most often accessed or talked about. These are Data Arts, the WESTAF CVSuite, Americans for the Arts, Arts and Economic Prosperity, the National Endowment for the Arts Bureau of Economic Analysis Project, Satellite Account Project, and then another one, Consultants and University Research Centers. In the next section of the webinar, I will comment briefly on each. Data Arts is a relatively new platform housing the previously established Cultural Data Project. Data Arts focuses on the collection of data from the nonprofit arts and the nonprofit cultural community. Data Arts encourages the use of data it collects for research into how the nonprofit arts and culture fields function, to inform grant making, to generally support the development of the nonprofit arts and culture sector. Those are all focuses that they talk about in their materials about how to use this data. The platform currently has profiles for approximately 11,000 organizations. There are estimated to be about 100,000 such organizations. Data Arts is working hard to fill in these gaps, but as you can see, at this time, Data Arts does not offer data that is national in scope, even though they are working on it. The Creative Vitality Suite was initially designed to take the place of economic impact studies and also to provide end users with an online tool with which to explore creative economy data. The project includes information on the nonprofit arts as well as the for-profit components of the creative economy. The CVSuite includes nonprofit arts data such as employment by occupation, earnings by occupation and industry, and revenues in nonprofit arts. Unlike Data Arts' organizational profile, the CVSuite only captures a more limited number of data points related to the nonprofit arts and data entities. However, the CVSuite provides this data on a nationwide basis. Data from this project, the CVSuite project, is used by researchers and administrators to report on the nature and impact of the creative economy. Users of the CVSuite have deployed the tool to compare their region's economy with other regions, to create benchmarks for planning purposes, and to identify areas of their creative economy that can be targeted for further development. Data from the tool has been used by entities such as the Washington State Arts Commission, the North Carolina Arts Council, and the City of Minneapolis. The project is a partnership between EMSI and WESTAF. EMSI is a major provider of data related to the economy and has the ability to provide additional national level data streams should we require them. I'm going to call on Brian at this point and see if he has anything to add to those comments about EMSI and the WESTAF CVSuite project.
Sure, I do. EMSI is at its core a data company, and I say that because that's the activity that our company engages in that has the most value for our clients. We collect data from a multitude of government sector data sources as well as some other public sector or private sector information, and we compile that and put it into a single model. So although you can get a lot of these data pieces from different places like the Bureau of Economic Analysis or Bureau of Labor Statistics or whatever, EMSI pulls it all together so you don't have to do that on an ad hoc basis. And actually, when you integrate those sources together, it can reveal values that aren't there when they stand on their own. So that process of modeling that data together is what we do and what we specialize in, and it makes for a great partnership with WESTAF because they're getting other data sets from on nonprofits and grants that they can integrate with this that allows us to get geographically specific information for a particular region. EMSI can provide the number of jobs, the amount of earnings, and those sorts of metrics, and then WESTAF can contribute those other metrics, and then obviously they do the work of indexing it, which when we talk about later, you'll find out is basically a way of collapsing a bunch of dissimilar data sets into a single number that's easily comparable across different regions.
Great. Well, thanks, Brian. Let's go on to the Americans for the Arts and Economic Prosperity Project, and that's an effort to capture the economic impact of the nonprofit arts. The study is conducted once every 5 years and relies on the participation of partners to administer surveys and generally gather local nonprofit organization information. The project also conducts audience intercept surveys that seek to identify ways that those attending performances and/or exhibitions spend money related to their visit to that event. This information is then run through a model to produce study area and also national estimates of impact. The last Arts and Economic Prosperity Project, report number 4, was issued in 2012 and contained information from 2010, data from 2010. The current AEP, report number 5, is now in process. It is expected to be issued in 2017. Moving on to the National Endowment for the Arts Bureau of Economic Analysis Satellite Account Project. This started in 2012 when the NEA and the BEA agreed to devise a system for valuing the arts and culture as a distinct sector of the nation's economy. In consultation with the NEA, the BEA made arrangements to track a cohort of arts and cultural commodities and industries and compute their annual impact on gross domestic product. The result of the first ever U.S. arts and cultural production satellite account began to consider artistic originals such as films, long-running TV shows, theatrical plays, and scripts, books, music recordings, commercial stock photography, and greeting cards as capital assets rather than expenses. And these assets added more than $70 billion to the GDP in 2012. So already a wonderful result from that research. Satellite Account Project documents the size of for-profit and the non-profit creative industries in the overall economy. It uses existing national level data and what is often called suppressed data, data that is available in aggregated form but not available to the public in detail. The project comes up with another way to consider the size of the creative economy. The findings are currently only available as national level data, although plans are underway to present state level data. This project at the moment has no interactive tool related to it, and I'm not aware of plans for one, but we will check on that in the future. Brian, any thoughts on the BEA NEA project?
Yeah, I think it's exciting if for no other reason than there's enough attention in different regions of the country that it's kind of pushed the NEA and BEA to focus on this. So those numbers are really useful for making kind of blanket statements about the significance of the arts economy. So when you read their reports, they put things into two numbers. It's output and value added, two metrics that are really useful for economic analysis. Output is basically the dollar value of what artistic organizations produce. And then value added, if you add together all value added for a region, it's equal to the gross regional product. If you add it together for the nation, it's gross national product. So it's giving you the component of our nation's economy that's attributable to the arts industries. So I don't know if anybody's done this yet, but I think one of the coolest things you could do with that is just find some other industry that everybody thinks of as a very significant portion of our economy, like the aerospace industry or something like that. Look at the GRP of that compared to the arts industry, and then you can make a statement like we're, as significant as X, Y, or Z. And that'll get attention in a different way. As Anthony said, it's not regional data, but having national data can be helpful for getting your conversations started. And I wouldn't hold out for that regional data to be released anytime soon. The BEA does not. They're very circumspect, which means that they move kind of slow. They're gonna take their time, make sure they're doing the methodology correctly. So I would say, a couple of years before they get to that point.
Great, thank you, Brian. Moving on to the final provider, we have the consultant and university research center-based reports, and the field has benefited from a number of consultant and research center-based reports on the nonprofit arts and the broader creative economy. For the most part, these reports are not sources of new data, but rather repackaged data from existing sources. In some instances, these entities conduct surveys on a local or state basis that add new information that is specific to a defined geographic area. In addition, some university research centers specialize in state economic data and the modeling of that data and contribute that knowledge to these reports. You should know that even though we call this repackaged data, there's nothing wrong with quality repackaged data, and we're not being critical of these entities whatsoever. We just want to make the point that they are not, for the most part, with some exceptions, surveying the field to collect parts of their data. Brian, any comments on the research center approach to providing data?
You said it well. I think another thing to add into this is that when you work with a university or a consulting partner, things could get expensive when asking them to look into those deep deep dives. So it may be worth it, but it may also not be worth it. It's up to you to determine your own priorities on that. I'd also say that groups like these, like those ones mentioned on the slide and others that I've seen, they will do a lot of the same types of things that EMSI will do. They'll just do it on an ad hoc basis. So they'll go into the specific data set from American Community Survey, and they'll pull the information. They'll use that to interpolate information from elsewhere. And anybody who's good with data modeling can do that kind of thing. So I wouldn't discourage people from working with providers like this. Just have your wits about you and know that make sure you know whether the methodology is being used or good.
Thanks, Brian. I now want to go on to indexes just briefly, and I want to mention them here because there are two indexes that are out there that are commonly referenced. One is the Creative Vitality Index, and the other is the Americans for the Arts Index. And I'm not going to talk about these at length here, but they're often confused with data streams. These are not data streams. These are ways of compiling and analyzing data. And I'm going to talk about those in a little greater detail later. Let's go on now to sources of data. Data needs to be collected, cleaned, and sometimes modeled before data can be used. Following are the ways each of the 5 data providers reviewed previously by me, sometimes how they collect and model data. Data Arts seeks to collect data on every nonprofit cultural activity in the nation. The benefit of the system is that Data Arts collects highly detailed information on the inner workings of nonprofit cultural organizations. The drawbacks are that the data is only available from states and localities that have elected to be part of the Data Arts collection system. Thus, the data that Data Arts has on hand is not national in scope, but they are working on it. The WESTAF CVSuite project, for that project, data comes from a multiplicity of sources. There are 4 core sources: the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of the Census, the National Center for Charitable Statistics that uses IRS 990 forms, and the final descriptive reports of state arts agency grant makers supplied by the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. These data sources are supplemented by EMSI that collects data from an additional 100+ sources and uses that data to refine and model the data from the core sources. When selecting the core sources, the developers of the CVSuite tool sought out data that was national in scope, available to be broken down in a variety of geographic components such as state, county, MSA, and zip code, also inexpensive to acquire, and widely accepted by the economic development community as reliable, high-quality data that can be used for meaningful decision-making. Brian, anything to add to that comment?
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful to the audience to just give a brief explanation of how this data modeling works. EMSI uses about 90 different state and federal sources, and you can see here most of those roll up to a few fairly well-known agencies with the federal government, including Commerce and Labor and Education. What people don't always know is that within those agencies, there are sub-agencies like the Bureau of Economic Analysis or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and each of those agencies are responsible for maybe 20 to 30 different data products that are updated monthly, quarterly, annually, depending on the situation. So all of us, this is a really unusual scenario, internationally speaking. Most countries, Canada, for example, they have one agency who's responsible for all of their data collection, that being StatsCan. So you can't trick the system by getting multiple StatsCan data sets and then trying to unsuppress information. But you can do it when there are different agencies involved. So in the US, we have that advantage that we can go to different sources and piece things together to get deeper information on it. So as an example of that, we at EMSI will use data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to get employment information for every county and every industry in the United States. And we'll go to the Bureau of Economic Analysis to get data on gross regional product by state and by metro area. The BEA does not publish GRP data by specific counties, but EMSI can figure that out because we know the employment for the metro, and we know the total gross regional product for the metro. And if we can simply assume that the way that the employment is distributed within that region is the same as the way the gross regional product is distributed within that region, then we can figure that number out. So you see, it is kind of a puzzle process of taking things that you know from multiple angles and then pushing them together until you can get a more precise number.
Great, thanks, Brian. Let me move on and talk a bit about the AFTA AEP, Arts and Economic Prosperity source of data. Approximately every 5 years, AFTA seeks partners to join its AEP project. Most of these partners are local arts agencies, and to participate, the agencies must agree to administer surveys of audience spending that measure the economic impact of cultural audiences in attending events. The audience data are collected through surveys administered by volunteers, usually. The information on the expenditures of nonprofit cultural organizations are collected through surveys administered by a state or local sponsor. The NEA BEA material, the Satellite Account Project, represents a deeper look at data and a higher level of analysis of what is already collected. With some minor exceptions, it uses the same data available to other researchers, especially data from the U.S. Bureau of the Census and the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. The difference between this effort and others is in the framing of the research question. That framing is one that seeks to identify and measure arts and cultural production as a segment of the national economy. It's a somewhat different exercise than localized efforts to describe the scope of and impact of a local creative economy. The NEA BEA project managers intend to apply their knowledge to the state level, and that's coming. Doing so, however, may be a challenge because although there is acceptance of this work on a national level and general agreement that it can be used in broad national and international dialogues, finding agreement on a sub-national level may be more problematic. We view the NEA BEA project as a rich resource of data that will be examined for a long time to come, but one that at the moment has very limited local application. Went on to consultants and university research centers and where they acquire data. Unless they conduct original survey research, which they can, or engage in some other kind of original data collection, the consultants and university research centers are usually repackagers of existing data. Again, nothing wrong with that. As long as that data is of high quality, doing so can be, repackaging can be very cost effective. And now I want to move on and talk just a little bit about modeling of data and then call on Brian to give his input into this conversation. There's a lot of modeling that goes on in many of these areas. A data model can be thought of as a diagram or a flow chart that demonstrates the relationship among data. Well-developed models can help identify errors in data streams and assist in the effective prediction of missing data. Data modeling can be applied in many different ways. In the data streams we are talking about, it generally has two uses. The first is to adjust a set of data in order to ensure that the data collected represents behavior that is already known. The second is to propose how data collected impacts other data. For example, the economic impact modeling can be used to translate the expenditures of cultural organizations into overall economic impact, which is measured in part by the number of times a dollar is recirculated in a local economy. Good modeling requires considerable resources and the ability of known tools, application of known tools. Under-resourced modeling can result in wildly fluctuating and not readily believable outcomes. This is why in the world of economic impact models, there are a limited number of accepted vendors and researchers, and these models are generally purchased in their most recent iteration from very established vendors. Brian, you're engaged in modeling every day. Any further comments on modeling?
Yeah, I'll say a few words on that. To harken back to the words of one of my professors in college, that economic modeling, any kind of statistical modeling, is not about getting a perfect representation of reality. It's about getting the relevant details correct, modeled correctly. So you're not going to get a model that perfectly represents reality any more than you would care about making a crash test vehicle have a perfect GPS system. You don't need it. It just doesn't make sense. So The process of modeling that EMSI uses in other companies is about figuring out what question are we trying to answer with this, and then getting those details nailed down correctly.
Great, thanks. And let's talk about a couple dynamics here that we can use the visualization related to modeling. This visualization illustrates one way to think about modeling data. In this image, some numbers are missing. However, we know a great deal about the envisionment of those numbers and can model or otherwise estimate the missing values. Because this set of numbers only has a few missing and the sum of the numbers in each row are known, the risk of error related to filling in the blanks or modeling in a very elementary way is very low. And let's move on to a different kind of modeling that unfortunately is pretty prevalent in our field, and this is modeling based on extrapolation. Data extrapolation is widely used in our area, our field, and by data extrapolation I mean the estimation of data based on a known sequence of data. For example, if I have data for about 10 states, I can use that data to predict what might occur nationally in the other 40 states. Extrapolation is often highly inaccurate because it does not take into account the sometimes complex ways that cultural entities operate, nor the nature of localized complex economic systems in which they function. Complex modeling can be a most useful tool. However, modeling sometimes something like how 50 states will behave based on data from 10 states can be very problematic. And I know Brian wants to say a few words about this too.
Yeah, this is really important because as we've been talking about modeling, the processes between good models and bad models do have some similarities. You do have to make assumptions. You do have to interpolate some things, but you want to do it with a higher level of accuracy than the example that Anthony just mentioned. So by way of example, if you think of yourself as a crime scene investigator and you know what somebody was doing at 10:47 a.m. and you know what somebody was doing at 3 p.m. that same day, you've got a window that you need to account for there that's pretty large. So you can't really say with any level of accuracy what that person was doing because they could have driven a long ways and they could have done a lot of things. Whereas if you knew where they were at 10:47, you knew they were at 11:15, the window of possibilities is much smaller. So good modeling is going to be of that latter variety. It'll have the margin of error, in a sense, is going to be lower. So if you think of the regional specializations of your community, you don't want to, if you're in a rural area that has a lot of agriculture, mining, or something of that variety, you're going to have different economic characteristics than if you're in a university town. Right? So don't accept models that are just going to kind of blanket over those kinds of differences.
Okay, let's go on to indexes or indices. Both pronunciations or uses of the term are correct. They are frequently used in the creative economy field. Let's review two that are most commonly used. One is I want to make the point that an index is a statistical measure of change. Indexes are composed of carefully selected sets of indicators that collectively are presumed to measure and track changes in a certain phenomenon. In the financial world, indexes are often related to the aggregate worth of a basket of company stocks, selected for their ability to reflect how the overall stock market is progressing. In the arts and creative economy, indexes are formed by identifying a basket of factors that serve as indicators of some dimension of arts and creative economy activity. This next visualization is a way to conceptualize an index. Here we see that by carefully selecting the representative samples of data, one can engage in a shortcut by selecting representative samples and then over time not have to scan the entire data set. And of course, when you do this, you have to be careful that in fact what you are selecting to be part of your index and your core indicators are truly representative of what you're attempting to measure. Now, the Creative Vitality Index uses a basket of indicators that is weighted at 20% with data from 7 indicators of participation in the arts, such as nonprofit cultural ticket sales and attendance at motion picture venues, and a 40% weighting of 30 occupations in the creative economy, such as fine artists, architects, and announcers, and fashion designers, and 40% with for-profit creative economy industry sales. The overall national average for the WESTAF Creative Vitality Index is 1. That would be the average. And all geographic regions are compared against this national average. States and localities below the number 1 are considered to be not as robust as the national average, and states above are considered to be in excess of. The Americans for the Arts Local Arts Index is unfortunately an index that's going to be discontinued. They just announced that. And it is composed of 81 equally weighted national level indicators of arts and creative activity. The AFTA index uses a baseline year of 2003, and that year is considered to be the benchmark against which growth is measured. And so I just wanted to make sure that in this webinar I underscore the fact that these indexes or indices are not data streams in themselves, but ways to look at data streams and aggregate them, so to not confuse the listeners. I want to close, and I'll give Brian some heads up on this. I was going to do these tips for the consumer, but in our run-through earlier, Brian did such a great job. I'm going to ask him if he doesn't mind starting the tips for the consumer, and then I will comment on anything he may not have covered. So Brian, does that work for you?
Yeah, sure, that'll work. So just to finally summarize the things that Anthony and I have talked about, some things to consider: is the data robust? So in other words, does it represent a credible collection effort, and does it have a reasonable number of collected data points so you can argue what you actually have captured the story? Number 2, is it modeled data, and was it built on a strong conceptual framework? And we're not expecting any of you guys to become statisticians overnight. We're just asking you to read the footnotes and look at the methodology and consider, did this have enough regional data for this model to be realistic? Number 3, is the data timely? Again, you'll see this somewhere in your reports or in the models or frameworks that you're looking at. It'll tell you when those data came from, and you want to use data that's more recent as opposed to older data. Finally, is your data available through an interactive tool, or is it simply a report? For example, the CVSuite is an online data tool, allows users to examine data for a number of different ways and extract that tells a localized story. In comparison, there are reports that are turned out as endless tables, but they are reports that are compiled by others and designed to address what the average user might want to know. So obviously the preference is for something that kind of updates itself and that you can view as needed.
Great. Well, thank you for that summary, and that concludes the formal part of our presentation. We have quite a few participants, so we have a number of questions, and we're going to try to work our way through those as quickly as we can. But before we do, Ardith Weaver from North Carolina reminds us that the NEA plans to offer economic data from the NEA BEA project in FY 2017. So look for state-level data in FY 2017. We have a question like, what are the benefits of the CVI and how is it used? We have quite a few people who have used the Creative Vitality Index, and it's used 2 different ways. Probably the most prominent way is to assess the dimensions of the scope of creative economy and nonprofit cultural activity in a region. And that's number 1, sort of to define it. And secondly, and probably more importantly, it's used for planning purposes. An entity using the CVSuite may discover that the index for architects is low. It's below 1. And because it's below 1, it indicates that there, for some reason, are fewer architects in that region than there are nationally in a similar region. So to me, the next thing that people do is say, all right, do we want to increase the number of architects? Is this a place where we could actually grow the architectural profession and, in fact, sell architectural services from our region to other regions, in a sense, increase the import of funds into this area? by exporting architectural services. So it's a diagnostic tool, it's a planning tool, and it's been used in those particular ways, and also as a descriptive tool of what are the dimensions of the creative economy. We have another question about using multipliers and whether multipliers should be used or not, and I'm going to ask Brian to comment on this in a second too. I'll just give my very brief response. I think in the cultural community, over a number of years, multipliers have been used incorrectly, unfortunately, to the point where frequently multipliers are not credible in our field. Multipliers can be used and they are legitimate, but I think one thing I find is that more and more people are saying, I would prefer to not use multipliers and just report the data that I am collecting directly, and so that is a trend that just you should be aware of that's going on at the moment. Okay, if we could scroll up a little bit, please, and we could take another look. Brian, anything more on multipliers? I said I'd get back to you. So,
yeah, I would say multipliers are useful and can be accurate. I think where people get scared off by them is in the component of it that's called what economists would call induced effects, or that's basically the household spending impact. So wherever you're getting the numbers from, they will break out. You need to dig into the numbers a little bit deeper. They'll break out between the indirect multipliers and the induced multipliers. So if you want a number that's more likely to stand up to scrutiny, just throw out the induced multipliers and use the other ones instead.
Another question, can I use data from different sources in the same report? Do you have a recommendation on how to approach this? And I'll start, and Brian may have something to add. You can mix and match data as long as you don't truly mix the data. There's nothing wrong with using data from several of these sources in the same report, but you need to make clear that the data was not mixed because it wasn't commonly, except in rare circumstances, collected the same way. It wasn't modeled the same way. So you're going to have yourself a real mess if you decide to mix things up. And, as long as the data streams are robust, there's nothing wrong with obtaining them from several sources. We've talked to people, for example, about using data arts data as in-depth data on the nonprofit cultural and economic area, and cultural industries area, and then using, for example, Creative Vitality Suite data for greater creative economy conversations and putting them together. So you have an in-depth report on nonprofit from data arts, and they do that very well. And then you have this broader view, and they could kind of be two sides of a book. Brian, anything to add to that about using data, combining data?
Yeah, I second that, and I do that all the time when I produce my reports. Specify where the data is coming from, and if you're doing that, it's most likely because you don't have the luxury of using a single source for all of those things. So just note, we went to such and such data source because it's better at answering this question, and that's totally fine.
Okay, let's conclude. We have many more questions, but we need to bring this to a close. So we're going to stop with the final question. How important is longitudinal data, and how do we approach, how should we value longitudinal data? And I'll start, and then Brian will continue. I think longitudinal data is useful depending on what the question you are asking is. I think people are always interested in what happens over a period of time, and that can be something that makes your report more meaningful. But in fact, if people are looking for a snapshot of what exists now and longitudinal data is not available, that it may not be necessary. However, I would say I like longitudinal data because it helps me assess the quality of the data I may have collected. If I am collecting data in an area over a period of years, and I have longitude, I can look at some trends That's interesting. But I can also see if the next year, maybe the current year I'm collecting data on, if that is so very divergent from the previous year, I would like to know that because maybe I've made a mistake. That's an interesting cross-check. It's an interesting cross-check on my work. Brian, anything to add to that?
Longitudinal data is great for knowing trends, whether a certain industry or occupation has been growing or declining. So yeah, it's super valuable. And again, some sources will have it and some won't, and some sources will, like EMSI, will even go a bit further and forecast it out. So if it's available, yes, it should be used.
Okay, well listen, we need to bring this to a close. We said we'd be 30 minutes or so. We're now at 45 minutes. Those of you who have asked questions we couldn't get to on the webinar, we will send you answers directly. And I want to thank Brian Points again and EMSI for helping us with this webinar and taking the time to do so. And look forward to seeing many of you on June 21st for a webinar